I want you to move from overwhelmed by information to confident in what really matters. I want to help you move from being unsure towards direction and purpose in your healthcare. I want to introduce you to health experts. I want to let you in on tough conversations on women's health. I want to give you a place where you can lean in and learn how to take care of yourself. Let's transform your health. Let's get clear on your goals. This is Women's Health Unplugged. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Robertson, naturopathic doctor. Okay, welcome to another episode of Women's Health Unplugged. Today, I am joined by my colleague and very good friend, Dr. Erin Ley, naturopathic doctor. Erin and I work together at our physical location in Burlington, Ontario at Clarity Health. And we are both facilitators for our Women's Health Collective in Burlington. Erin, I'm so excited for us to have this conversation because I feel like we have this conversation all the time. Actually, it's just today we've decided to record it. So thank you so much for joining me on the podcast this morning.
Thank you so much for having me. I completely connect with that we've totally had this conversation through text, Zoom, little notes on our desk, but we've never hit record. So I'm excited about this.
Yeah, I'm excited too. So before we kind of dive into our topic, so we're talking about community, loneliness, isolation, and then even like just before we hit record with it, we're talking about like the difference between women just like surviving versus thriving in their healthcare. Can you walk us through sort of like how, because I love your Instagram, I love like the messages that you put out for women about acceptance, self-compassion, and belonging. Can you just tell us a little bit of background about yourself, how you got to this place in your career and who you work with, like, and you know, the kinds of women that are in your practice?
So I was completely lost and confused for much of my university career. I think I kind of just like stumbled upon this idea of taking into consideration the totality of a person, which led me to naturopathic medicine. But my passion is listening to people's complete story. The beautiful, the kind of scary, the stuff that you're like, oh no, I can't share this with absolutely anyone. I like hearing people's stories, and I think that's lent me to be a really good listener, friend, health detective, health strategist, you name it. And now it's led me to be a Wild Collective facilitator. Like that just fuels me hearing like women's fears, what's stopping them, what's driving them. That's the type of woman that I love seeing at Clarity Health is let's figure this out. Like what's going on? What's your deep passion? What's your deep drive? That's who I love to see in practice. So when the opportunity came for us to have this collective health experience, I was like, yep, sign me up. Absolutely. And it came at an important time for me personally. With the beginning of COVID is when we started to launch our first session. I remember really struggling at the beginning of COVID. I don't know when it kind of kicked in difficulty wise for you, but it was like a switch for me. So yeah, absolutely. This trying to let women realize that they should be the forefront of their lives. So often women are, they feel like their purpose is to serve others. How you are as a wife, as a mother, as a daughter, and it's your purpose on this planet is to serve others. And it's like, well, no, your birthright is to take care of yourself. And so often that's forgotten. And I love to help women realize that you got to take care of yourself, girl.
Yeah, there's so much there for us to kind of unpack, and I'm excited for us to sort of think about that because first of all, like just that concept that you just brought up there, that women, like their whole purpose and role and even the words they use to describe themselves are often in relation to the words that they're using to serve other people, right? Or you say like, well, who are you? Right? Who
Mhm.
are you? Well, I'm a daughter, right? I'm a sister, I'm a mother, right? They're not saying like I am a like fiery, strong, compassionate, right? They're not using adjectives to describe themselves. They're using their
Mhm.
role
Roles.
to
Yes.
describe who they deeply are. Which like is just inherently taking away so much power, right? And it's not that those things are not important. You can be all of those roles and you can have all of those relationships, but they are not like deep at your core who you are, right? Because
Mhm.
if that is all, right, if that's all there is, then yes, you're eating toast crusts before you become a mom taxi driver all over the place, right? Like you're not taking care of yourself like in your like as you as an individual.
Mhm. And I think that can be really scary as a, 40, 50-year-old woman as we start to get older, is to really turn inwards and try to discover that ikigai, like that purposeful living. Because if you've just been from daughter to wife to mother, it's like that's kind of scary to dig deeper and figure out deeper purposeful living as opposed to oxygen in, carbon dioxide out living.
Yeah, like the difference between like surviving versus thriving, right? And
Absolutely.
I mean, you and I both come from like this massive science background, right? Where we're super evidence based, super, in air quotes, geeky. And this on the surface level appears like we're talking about something that's just not scientific, right? Like this is like
Mm.
a complete divergence away from, we use this thing to treat this thing, right? But
Mhm.
the evidence is actually really powerful around community and loneliness. We even share that with the women that are in our group, is that the impact that isolation and loneliness has on health is really profound. And I think we maybe like intuitively or we can cognitively maybe understand that when we think about the elderly, right? Like we think about the
Mhm.
elderly, we're like, if they're alone in their apartment and they're not particularly mobile or independent, for sure that's a health risk, right?
Mhm.
But women are experiencing that in their, younger years in their lives where they are independent, they are, have full physical capability. They, in theory, have, the possibility of connection, and yet they're living those like isolated, lonely lives then, right? And the evidence is
Mm.
actually really strong that like the lack of social connection that you have in your life increases your health risks. It increases your risk of just even straight up death. Um,
Mhm.
but we're not really addressing it, right? Like if anything, we're more isolated, and this is like good timing coming, through the pandemic. We're more
Mhm.
isolated than we had been before.
Yeah. And it can, with the research there, it's like perceived loneliness. So
Yes.
you can be surrounded by people, but if they're not congruent or in line with maybe your personal goals, that can still feel incredibly lonely.
Yes. Or if the way
Mhm.
that you show up in those groups is
Yes.
not authentic, is not
Mhm.
vulnerable, is
Mhm.
not, sharing, then that also, increases your loneliness. You're right. You could absolutely be surrounded by people. You could have your, again, in air quotes, girlfriends. And if that's not an authentic, deep connection with those
Mhm.
people, that can still be lonely. And that is still a health risk, right?
Yep. Mhm. And that's the we've talked about, and you've talked about family of origin stuff, right? Like who grew up with. You can find your group of people out there. You can still love that family of origin, but they may not have life goals, health goals, and that's okay. It's about finding those people that you can feel aligned with, and that flow between thoughts, emotions, and action needs to be in line. And when we live this disjointed life where we're surrounded by people who do not line up with those things, that can feel so lonely and isolating.
Mhm. And it's, I mean, even in the way that we, conduct healthcare, we have not exactly set it up in the way that would make people feel connected, right? And certainly, like, there's something to be said about confidentiality, right? Like, that's
Sure, privacy.
obviously, that is a very important aspect. And that's, I think when people think about like sharing around their health, right? They like, that's like, you automatically go there, right? To think about concepts and confidentiality. And that's not really what we're saying. But I always want women to just, I wish that women knew, and I've said this before, that the woman before them in the waiting room and the woman after them in the waiting room have a story that is not that dissimilar from their own,
Mhm.
right? They have that story of not completely understanding how their body works, for like looking ahead at their mothers or the maternal figures above them the generation ago and not wanting to turn out like that,
Mhm.
right? Or having a younger generation coming up below them and having fears about how that generation is going to thrive, right, in the world that we're in. That, whether women have suffered from cancer, whether they suffer from an autoimmune disease, whether they're suffering from hormonal symptoms, that the thread of loneliness, lack of understanding of how her body works, a desire for more or something bigger in her life that she's yet to figure out how to achieve, those threads are actually there in all of those women's stories.
Mhm. And I do love that vibe of like sitting and without fear of judgment and fear of what you're saying and your personal truth, to have that like flow out of someone and to witness that happening to someone just like gives me goosebumps. And absolutely, like, we could have 10, 12 patients a day in our practice, and the woman before struggling with protein adequacy, the woman before struggling with, well, I want to eat this way but everyone in my family does this, and I want to decrease my alcohol consumption but everybody else has 3 happy hours a day, like it's, and to let women know that their story has threads of alignment with other women just by nature of the societal stuff that gets put on women. We have a lot of the same threads throughout our stories, whether we're talking to a woman who's 22 or we're talking to a woman who's 65. It's fascinating.
Mm-hmm. That
Fascinating.
that whole experience though of like, go in a little room by yourself, right?
Mm-hmm.
Share your stuff. And I mean, we have this luxury of time where we actually get to hear all of those things versus, certainly there's conventional medical appointments that don't last very long. And maybe women can't get into their deepest, darkest fears and desires in a
Mm-hmm.
7-minute appointment. Um, but even that idea of like going into a room by yourself and having a conversation about how your body works is isolating, right? Like, it feels like you're the only one, right? It feels like you're the only one who didn't know how your hormones worked, or you're the only one who's curious about, your mood as it relates to your cycle, or you're the only one who's pushing this boundary, trying to figure out how to live a more purposeful life. And then
Mm-hmm.
they leave, with their wonderful treatment plan, right? Where we've given them some guidance and some strategy, but still, they're still alone, right? They're still like taking that piece of paper home by themselves. And we kind of say, like, cross our fingers and hope that they can muster up enough, internal motivation in order to succeed. Where this concept of community medicine that we've brought into the practice is this idea that, okay, lots of these topics we can do together, right? Like, lots of this education, like you said, like protein adequacy, that does not need to be done as a one-on-one interaction with a practitioner. That is something we can learn together. Um, that whole idea of like pulling women in together to be able to share the knowledge and to share in their experience, it does miraculous things. Like, what are you noticing in your women? I'm excited for you to kind of share, because we do have two different groups and we don't sit in on each other's women's health groups. But what are you noticing in those women?
So I've noticed a few things. So one thing that I've noticed is I like to think that people listen when I when I give them advice, right? I think that I every lecture, every class that we have, I find that there's an overarching like theme, like something that women can take home and try to accomplish and do, right? So, for example, the hormone, our menstrual cycle, there was a lot of focus and women really excited about ground flax seeds. That's just kind of where the conversation went. And I think half of the women were like really diligent with incorporating their ground flax seeds, and the other half were like, I tried it, I'm gonna keep going, I'm gonna try again. But one of the women were like, you gotta do it, you gotta do it. And just having that firsthand experience from someone that was in their group made the rest of the women incorporate those ground flax seeds way more diligently. So I think that having that community being like, you gotta just keep doing it. You got it. And that like drive forward that's just one instance that stands out in my head, because I was sitting there being like, yes, 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 yes. So that was really awesome. The other piece is I like that we meet once a month. That slower incorporation of habit has been really important for our gals, for sure, right? Like, it's not like one session a week, it's once a month. And this slow incorporation of habit is so important, right? We are what we repeatedly do. And there needs to be time so that you can learn how to repeatedly incorporate things. So
Isn't
it's
that
more
like a
your
stark
efforts.
contrast? Sorry to
Yeah,
interrupt. But
no,
that's a
go.
stark contrast to most of the health programs that we watch women do,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which is like 21 days of only eating cucumbers, or 10 weeks of boot camp where you're going to exercise 18 times a day. That's in stark contrast to what we normally watch women do, and even in contrast to what the evidence actually suggests that we should do to help with behavior change, to help with growth and empowerment and all of those pieces we're trying to achieve. That women can say, oh, this in these next 2 weeks, I'm going to do some kind of cleanse or whatnot, and probably nail it, right? Because it's only 10 days. And when the 10 days is over, they can do whatever they want. But when we watch women through a 10-month process, they've had good weeks, they've had bad months in there. And yet, right, there is this consistent showing up that allows them to leverage the power of each other and that connection and community to actually move the needle forward in a sustainable way, right? So that when those 10 months are over, that all the things that they've incorporated, included in the conversations that we've had with them over that period of time, like that's what turns into long-term change for women.
Mm-hmm. I want it to be as automatic as like you putting on your seatbelt or like brushing your teeth in the morning. It should just be like a thing that happens. It shouldn't be like, oh, I got to do this, and oh, I forgot to do that. It happens, right?
And I think when women mess up, right, like on their plan, there's so much shame associated with that they often can't get back on the wagon, right? And this idea that like every month they're going to connect with those women, right? And we open most of our sessions with talking about our wins, because again, that's not something that we typically do, right? We don't often celebrate. We're such like progressive, goal-oriented, driven human beings. Women can be like, oh yeah, like I totally, nailed my thesis and, handed in all of my stuff, but now I'm going to do this, right? Like we can't even take a second to pause and reflect and celebrate those things that we did. We can't even say, I maintained my weight through a very difficult season of my life, right? Women are always looking for, yeah, whatever, like, whatever, I barely succeeded there. Now, what am I going to do? Right. And so we start that session by talking about what our wins are. And it's so amazing to hear those women kind of reflect on what winning actually means to them. And I think the more vulnerable they get, the less like productivity we're talking about as part of our wins, right? The more conversations they're seeing as wins, or the way that they're showing up in their life, or the grace they're giving themselves to even not make any change over a month is so powerful. Because again, it's like, it's reinforcing that this is kind of a lifelong journey for them, right? Versus this like rapid detox, life overhaul, which is not what we're into. And that's not what the research says we should do either.
Oh, for sure. And just even when you're like, Jordan's going to ask me what my wins are, it almost like shifts your entire daily perspective, right? It's like, Jordan's going to ask me how many yellow cars I saw. I better keep my eye peeled for all of the yellow cars. And that shift in mindset will change neuroconnections, like absolutely. Instead of just always seeing the down, the negative, the fail, the shame, the guilt.
What
It's
do I
just
have to
like,
do next?
what were my wins?
Mm-hmm.
I dropped a pen and my first thought wasn't, Erin, you dummy, you dropped a pen, right? And just shifting those neuroconnections, that's where the work starts, right? That's the work. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that connection piece too, like, like you mentioned with the ground flax seeds, that's such a cool, right? Like idea that like when we stumble, we often don't have those people in our lives, especially from a health perspective, to say, hey, you know what? It just pick it back up, right? Like keep going. Like, and that accountability piece is so important, especially for women when their nutrition needs are different than the people they live with, when their goals and values are different than the people they live with, when their habit change is something that's like diametrically opposed to the people they hang out with, right? It's so difficult to make those changes when your partner eats a bag of chips every single day sitting at the couch, right? Or your girlfriends have a glass of wine at 3 o'clock in the afternoon when you go out in the middle of the week, or when your mother says that you shouldn't want for more, right? Like it is so difficult for women to persist through failure or through stumbles when the mirroring they're getting back from those other people is that she's not worth it, right? But
Absolutely. Yeah.
this group, or the concept of a group, whatever that looks like for you, however you would create that community, actually gives those women a safe place to land, and a something to hold on to when they are stumbling. 19 other women that say, hey, it's okay that you didn't like the flax in your smoothie, why don't you put it in some muffins, right? Or it's okay that it went stale and you had to throw it out, just go buy a new one, right? Like we need those people in our lives. And I think it's easy to like not have that, right? Or it's more common for women to not have that. Our group this week, we talked about stress, which was quite timely given that, with the back to school, those are maybe the most appropriate air quotes of the whole episode so far. And we talked about stress, and one of the women brought up, a pattern that she'd even noticed in herself of, getting up in the morning and immediately going to her phone and looking at social media, getting news information about the pandemic, and then rotating between like Facebook, email, news, Twitter, news, Facebook, Instagram, and then and 45 minutes into one coffee later, realizing that she's let all of these avenues kind of change the way she was experiencing her morning. So we brought up this idea of, or I brought up the idea of, create before you consume. And as a group, we've committed to a month of gratitude practice before we pick up our phones. which even for me, right? Like even for me as a connection to those women, like I swear to God that I probably benefit as much or more than the women in my group every month. This morning, this was my first morning, had to get up, and my natural tendencies to just pick up my phone and do all those things. I was guilty of doing all those things at the same time and had to not touch my phone, pick up my journal because I knew that all of those women were trying their hardest this morning to do the same thing and write out what my gratitude statement of the day was. And turns out I actually didn't pick my phone up for like 30 minutes, which is a friggin' miracle, basically. But it was that connection and accountability because even I don't really have that very often in my own life, right? But I've been able to leverage these group of women, even though I'm their facilitator, to help me have that level of accountability and connection that I hadn't had.
Yeah, tell me, were you when you started being a facilitator, were you nervous about showing up as like a real human being, like not just Dr. Jordan, but as like Jordan, the human, right? Because I was like thinking about, I was like, was I nervous about that? Or was I like relieved?
Yeah.
Like, oh, I can just like I also struggle with the phone, the stress eating, the being on my phone before bed. Like, this is a process, right? Like, we're not the be all end all of health. We're on our own journey as well. What was your experience with starting to be a facilitator in that way?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I've talked about this like in other avenues and talking about Wow Collective is that, I think in my whole journey of my career, I definitely did not show up as authentically at the beginning. So when I graduated, I was very young when I graduated, even though I had like hella credentials, I still was young, kind of inexperienced woman. Right. And so, although I had all the academia in the world, I didn't have that like life experience as a woman. And so I found it more challenging to show up authentically. I felt like I needed to have a persona or be someone. I definitely had like massive boundaries between like myself as a person versus myself as a practitioner. I didn't tell as many jokes. I was not, I would never swear in an appointment. Like none of those things. I just was not myself, right? Um,
Mhm.
and 4 or 5 years into my career, I noticed that I was more confident to start to let her out a little bit. And I don't know if it was just me working through my own, postpartum depression and loneliness
Mhm.
and isolation to then meet that woman, right? Meet that woman who was me in my office. If it just got easier or if I just had had enough, right? Of not
Mhm.
like being an authentic person at work, that I started like, I always joke like spilling my coffee on people's lap work and sharing those pieces of those weird, quirky, more authentic pieces of myself um, in my patient appointments, right? And
Mhm.
say, like, I mean, I could always help treat someone's acne or help them get pregnant or whatever the task at hand was medically. But it wasn't until I started showing up authentically that those women were like truly getting better. Like,
Mhm.
they were taking the bull by the horns and showing up authentically and asking for more and quitting their dead end job and standing up for themselves in their relationship. Like they started to like legit get better where versus like
Mhm.
just their health problem that they had come for in the beginning. So I feel like when Wild Collective came in, it was just like beautiful timing for me because I already was on this process of like, what is my message, right? And Michelle Paris, who's the creator of the program, she puts it beautifully. She says your mess is your message, right?
Mhm.
And I don't know if I would show up as deeply for these women if I had not walked through some of those pains myself, right? The loneliness, the burnout, the depression, the isolation, the PMS, now the perimenopause, which I totally get. But like, to be able to show up and share my story as a way of serving other women versus seeing my story as a flaw, um, it was beautiful timing for me to become that facilitator because I was so ready. I was so ready to sit down and be like, I'm sober. I, went through all of these processes and these personal struggles, because when we don't share those stories, we are not showing up like as our greatest sort of service for each other, because we're leaving each other to feel like we're isolated. We're watching each other's highlight reel on social media, and then we're looking at our own kind of messy life and going like, good God, like I must be doing things terribly wrong because I'm not, it certainly does not look like that.
Girl.
Yeah. What do you think?
The sharing piece made me nervous as a facilitator. I think that, as we've talked about our Myers-Briggs personalities quite often, and mine as the mediator is I listen to many, but I speak to few, right? So this concept of absorbing other women's stories and listening and validating and consuming their fears, passions, etc., no problem. I got that. But the idea of leading off the discussion with my own piece, that was hard. It was hard. And I do think that, being a few classes in, it's gotten easier, it's gotten more fun, and even showing up a bit more authentically through social media has been, again, difficult, but really starting to get to that understanding of Erin. Because again, we talk about this when we introduce the Wild Collective, but I was absolutely confused as to my personal identity. I lived my life very polarizing and thinking one must be right and then the other piece is wrong. So then what's going on in the core of Erin? Like, it was very confusing. And the identity piece in women's health is, I think, fascinating, right? Like figuring out who the heck we are.
Mm-hmm.
What's our purpose?
Trusting that, right?
Yeah, and trusting it and sitting with it. And so I was definitely nervous about the sharing piece at first. Gotten better at it. So I need to. You take a little look at the clock and you're like, oh, Erin, your sharing hour is over.
And that's a question that we get asked often about the program, is whether or not women have to share, right? And I had recently posted about that on an Instagram story, because someone asked the question, and I actually had other women who are either in our Wild Collective or who are in other Wild Collectives, like in Ontario, say, I wish I could tell those women that they may be nervous to share, but by the end, they're going to want to share, right? That and I know because I'm an introverted person, to that idea or that image that you're going to get called out and someone say like, hey, what are you stressed about? Right? That's like total nightmare.
Nightmare.
Which, certainly not mandatory. And I think depending on what we're talking about, the women move in and out of this comfort of being willing to share. And there are some weeks where women just observe and bear witness to the other women's stories. And then there's other times where they do have something of value to offer the group, or they can see how their story is valuable to other people and then lean in and share, even though that's not what their tendency is. I have women in my group who've said, signing up was like an out of body experience for me. I have one woman who was like, I don't know what came over me. She's like, this is not my normal. I would not normally take this risk, but I knew that I needed this so badly that I just hit enter. Like I said, submit, right? I signed up. She's like, it was like an out of body experience, because if you ask rational me, I would have said, I don't need this. I'm strong enough without this. I don't want to share with these other women. I don't need their help. But yet, right? Like there was something in her that made her go, this is a risk you can't afford to not take this risk, right?
Mhm.
And see what this actually feels like to reach out for help, to listen to other women who also need some help, right? Because there's so much value in that too.
Yes. And I think the empowerment that our women are getting from knowing that every struggle, every triumph is important for other women as well, right? That trial of, oh, I made these protein pancakes, this did not work, but this worked. Something as simple as that recipe can help someone else up their protein game. Or maybe it is about learning to say no, which always comes up
Hmm.
in our classes. Like, just how did you show up, how did you say no, and even like those strategies can be applicable. Or even just the story. Your story will serve other women. Your story will give strength to other women, because so many women are like, I don't know if I have anything to say. I don't know if my burden, my sadness, my slip ups, my wins is as important as someone else's, or as big as someone else's. And that's not true. We can't use that metric. Your strength, your story is important, and it will serve other people. We want to hear it.
Hmm. And
Mhm.
like you and I have had this luxury of being able to hear it all along, right? Like I love working with the women who are in their late like 50s and 60s. They've lived 1,000 lives, right? By the time they sit down in my office, they've had love, they've lost, they've had, passion, they've had despair. They've lived 1,000 lives, and getting to listen to those pieces and how it's interwoven in their health story has always been something that I've, been absolutely fascinated by.
Mhm.
But when we bring those women together, they get to leverage each other and to just up the ante, right? To like ask more of themselves, to push themselves, because they get to
Mhm.
hear the strength in all of those women's stories.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think that I love that, like your mess is your message, right? That like we're not helping each other by pretending we've got our shit together.
And it's no fun.
No, you're right. It isn't. It's an
But
awful
it's
lot of
it's so
work
true.
to
It's
pretend
a
you have
lot
your
of
shit
work.
together.
It's
It's
exhausting. It's a
exhausting.
lot of work. Like, and I mean, come on. We have those messes, and we fall down, we bump our knees, we skid our knees. But having like those women who are on a similar forward momentum path as you, they'll say, up, up you get, we'll help you.
Mhm, mhm,
And I think very rarely we might be surrounded by our girlfriends, our work friends, our kids, our partners, our family, but still feel incredibly left out, right? Because not everyone is on this upward momentum, spiraling upwards path that you want to be on. So,
it's so true, and
mhm.
I think when we're out of practice of asking for help, even in the group that we're already in, or the group we say like we're assigned, right? Like our family of
Mhm.
origin or people that we are with, but like you said, are not on the journey that we are on, that even your asks for help can fall on deaf ears, right? Like, because when you show up as this, not quite authentic version of yourself, the really put together, highlight real version of yourself, when you start to wave that white flag, not everyone can recognize it, right? I shared a story with my Wild Collective group last night about my own personal burnout, which I should probably do a whole podcast episode on just that. But I shared with them that in that moment, the amount of loneliness that I had, because I was struggling so deeply. But yet, when I asked for help, and I feel like I was being clear as day that I needed help, like I need help, whether that was text, whether that was email, whether those were phone calls, but that was not who I was to those people, right? I was not the person that you would ever drive to help, or that you would ever make a meal for, or that you would ever take my kids from me for. I was not that girl for those other people. I was the strong, had her shit together, knows a lot, right? Highly educated, super productive, never late for anything. Well, I shouldn't say that part. I meant like handing stuff in and like
Got it.
projects. Like personally, I'm probably late. But I wasn't that girl to those people, right? Because I never had shown that side of myself. I had never asked for help. I didn't have the kind of community that allowed me to ask for help. So when I did, and I didn't get help, that was such a turning point for me to realize that like I had cultivated an entire community of people who didn't really know me, or people who knew me as I love Glennon Doyle's like my representative, right? Like they knew me as the strong version of myself, but no one had accepted me as the weak version of myself. Um, and that put me on like a totally different trajectory as far as looking for community, friends, colleagues, workplace support that was different, right? Where I could cry and get help, or I could reach out and say I'm struggling and no one offer me a solution. They just give me a hug, right? Um, I didn't have that because I wasn't that. I wasn't showing up in that way. And so I love this idea that these women who for the most part don't know each other before, right? There's no context, no history, no baggage, none of that, that they can just show up fully as themselves from day one. It's such a beautiful thing because it allows them to just leverage that experience to what their needs are. Um, Rather than having to show up as the like version of themselves that maybe they've fallen into in other aspects of their life.
Mhm. And I do love that because people have asked, like, do I need to know someone to join? Do I need to bring like a friend? You're more than welcome. But there's something kind of freeing about stepping into this new group completely, like, for lack of a better words, naked, right? Without like the stuff on you. Because it's interesting to pay attention to how people around you make you feel when you fail, right? Like your experience of, you know, needing help, needing assistance. Like, what do people around you make you feel when maybe you didn't reach the 10 out of 10? And paying attention to that, because I'll tell you that your collective, there's been nothing but encouragement and listening ears when women may feel like they didn't reach, whatever pinnacle they wanted to reach, right? And
Mhm.
whether it's offering that. And I love that women are now asking, do you need concrete steps of help, or do you need a listening ear? Which I
Right.
think is the best advice that you could give anyone.
That's right. What does support actually look like for you in this moment,
What
right?
can I give you right now?
Yeah. Which was
Solve my problems, or yep.
language that was not in my circle, like at that time, right?
Mhm.
Where no one knew what to do, nor were they, really even capable of doing the things I needed them to do. Um,
Mhm.
Erin, what's your sort of like big like message for women? I always ask this at the end of the podcast because I love to hear like what drives my guests, right? Like what their sort of passion message is. If you were able to stand up and talk to thousands of women, which is what we're capable of doing in this setting on the podcast,
Mhm.
is what do you want them to know? What do you want them to take away from this conversation? And what do you want for them?
That it is your birthright to take care of yourself. You didn't need to put in a certain number of work hours. You didn't need to reach that, you know, bonus amount at work. You didn't need to get your kids to a private school. You didn't need to do absolutely anything. Baseline, you deserve to take care of yourself. And if the idea of carving out some time for you, scares the crap out of you, that's something we need to address. Carving out time for yourself gives a message to your family, to the universe at large, and to yourself that you are worth it. Because if I may start to speak kind of out out there, the world needs what your purpose is. And you can't do that if you're constantly serving other people at the expense of you. So carving out that time to serve your higher purpose, whether that's time alone to actually sit and think, what am I on this planet for, to do? Because you deserve to feel well. You deserve to feel like you can achieve that higher purpose because the world needs it. We do. So come on, ladies. We can do it.
I know. I love that. And that's one of like our core messages, I think, even as a clinic, right? Is that well, women are going to change the world, right? I always give the example, like, what if Michelle Obama had PMS, right? Like, what if AOC felt like garbage 50% of the time, or didn't have the infrastructure and support she needed to get up and change the world, right? What if all of these women that we admire, right? What are they doing? They're showing up, right? And they're showing up like in their full, healthy, I hope, versions of themselves, that each of the women that we work with have some big purpose for why they're here. I am not going to change the environment in my practice. I am going to heal the woman whose mission it is to heal the environment, right? I'm going to change a woman's life who's going to change policy. I'm going to change a woman's health who's going to raise the next prime minister of this country. And that's such a, oh, I just got goosebumps.
Oh, yes.
So powerful, right?
It is.
We know and we can see it, right? We're starting to, like, we are on the cusp of watching women do big things. We're all capable of doing those big things, but not if we're eating peanut butter sandwiches sitting in a hockey arena 5 nights a week. Not if we're crying in bed half the month because we're unwell because of our hormones. Not if we are not willing to show up and share what our ideas are, right? Because we feel too small or we don't feel like we have a spot at the table. Every time a woman stands up for help for herself, she's standing up for all the other women. I have one more personal story before we close off today. I had experience recently with a professional that it was a business transaction that was happening, and this person actually reached out to my husband to ask if I was available to talk on the phone. And when I finally did get on the phone with that human being, I knew that I needed to tell them that that was not appropriate. I knew I needed to be like, okay. And I'm like a stark feminist. I have not had to stand up for myself in that way. I've had the privilege of not being faced with too many of those direct moments where I've needed to stand up for myself as a woman. I absolutely recognize my own privilege in that, because many women have to do this on a daily basis. And as the conversation was coming to a close and we were dealing with the thing that we were on the phone to deal with, I could feel my palms getting sweaty. My heart was racing. And I was like, if you don't do this, you are not standing up for all those other women, right? You must. And it was something so simple as me to say, hey, it was not appropriate for you to email my male partner to find out if I could have a phone call with you. You have my contact information. The next time you need to speak to me, you're going to reach out to me directly. Capiche?
Capiche.
Capiche?
Mm-hmm.
And I knew, like, in that moment, I was standing up for something bigger, right? And it's these small moments where if women step into their power, if they take care of themselves, if they show their daughter what taking care of themselves look like, that we are changing that path, right? We're changing that trajectory of women's health, like kind of like one one no at a time, one right standing up for ourselves at a time. Um, Thank you so much for sharing with me today, Erin. I will kind of close off by saying that the fall semester for our Wild Collective does open for registration on September 22nd, which is a Tuesday. We do have free information sessions about the Wild Collective for women who are curious and interested in understanding the program and the value that we offer for that particular program. But the enrollment actually opens on the 22nd, and we have more interest than spaces. And so we are definitely have this expectation that we're going to work with a full cohort of women over the next 10 months. And we'll put the links in the show notes for how to get better connected with us or how to ask a question if you have a direct question about whether or not this program is something that's valuable for you. It's currently done remotely. And so women from all over are capable of joining us. You don't need to be local to us. This is a wonderful way for women who are out of province or out of country to connect. The meetings are at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, though. So certainly keep that in mind if you're not in our local area. Thank you so much, Erin. I love like us turning our normal everyday conversations into something that we can share with a broader audience. Because I think that our lunchtime coffee breaks need to be shared with a wider group of women.
Absolutely. I was going to say, if we recorded every conversation we had, we would be on part 4,000.
We would. I know.
But I'm glad that we did this and recorded it. And I love having these big female strength conversations with you. I always leave feeling so empowered to keep supporting women, keep throwing women's health in the forward direction. And I'm so glad to be here at Clarity Health and be a Wild Collective facilitator. It's definitely part of my higher purpose. So
we're doing it. Awesome. Well, you have a wonderful work day. Thank you for hopping on here with me so early this morning. And we will be sharing more of this story and more of our offerings for women on the 22nd. And I can't wait for us to start this new chapter of Women in the Wild Collective for the fall.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed that episode of Women's Health Unplugged. It's my absolute passion to bring women quality and science-informed information about their health so that they can make empowered, good decisions about their health care. I'd like to invite you to join me in my Facebook community, Women's Health Unplugged. There we share live videos, blog posts, and behind-the-scenes information about the podcast, where you can connect with me and other women who are interested in their health care. You can find us at facebook.com/groups/WH Unplugged. We'll see you there.